Hi everyone, I'm Alex Lamb, Chief Exec of Lanterne Rouge and your host here today on The Real Work. I'm an organisational psychologist and professional coach, and I'm personally interested in how careers work. Our mission here is to open access to career success and workplace belonging for everyone through community conversations. We want to learn and share what drives our personal decisions and how we define and shape our work environments. The Real Work explores how we show up for each other in all manner of professions, unpacking the experiences that shape us and how we can each play a role in designing our future of work. So my guest here today is Dr. Summer Finlay, freshly minted, and congratulations. Dr. Finlay is Yorta Yorta woman who is passionate about social justice, particularly for Indigenous peoples around Australia and globally. She has a PhD, as mentioned, and extensive experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander public health research, policy and communications. Dr. Finlay is a postdoctoral research fellow with Canberra University, a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and is a contributing editor for COACHEES Health Media, which I love the name of. It's ironic for those who aren't Australian. She works in several capacities across the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, not-for-profit, university and for-profit sectors. She's written for NITV, The Guardian Australia and Indigenous X, and is an editor for the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health and a member of the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales Ethics Committee. So Dr. Finlay is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Vice President for the Public Health Association of Australia, co-chair Indigenous NCDs, and is the co-vice chair of the World Federation of Public Health Associations and Indigenous Working Group. So it's a fantastic bio, and welcome, Dr. Finlay. May I call you Summer?
Yeah, you can.
Thank you.
Only people I don't like will have to call me Dr. Finlay, I think.
Fair enough. All the people there are in trouble with you.
Yep.
I definitely wanted to make sure that we had your permission to do that, because doctor is such a huge achievement, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
So our last guest just wanted me to let you know, her parting words to you were, you're going to love this. So no pressure on you or on me. But that was passed along from Carla Palachek. She's a topographer and a street artist just outside of Canberra, and we had a great conversation last week. So that was her gift to pass on to you.
Lovely. I'll have to think of a gift for the next presenter.
Exactly. That'll be my last question to you. So based on your bio, I mean, just hearing the wealth of experiences you've had, you've clearly had a lot of opportunity through those organisations, your study and your research, to do a lot of thinking, I would say, and of course a lot of observation and personal experience around structures and policy initiatives in your space. So where do you see the opportunity for public health, both as an employer and as, you know, servicing the people who are receiving those health services? How can you see inclusiveness kind of bubbling up or coming to the forefront there?
Yeah, so public health or population health is actually something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do really well, because we tend to live and work as a collective society. So actually looking outside of ourselves is what we traditionally do. So I think public health organisations or other health organisations that want to actually branch into public health can benefit from that worldview that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring. So structurally, if organisations are recognising the value that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring, and the fact that there's actually a lot of that they could learn from the way that the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, for example, actually run their businesses and think about population health as a core part of their clinical health. So if organisations can kind of flip their dialogue, rather than thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as in deficit or as a sum total of the negatives, and start thinking about the value that they bring to their organisation, I actually think we'll start to see a shift.
And what does that look like? I know you've shared with me around definitely that collective, you know, and even an extended family sense. Like, you shared in the past some sort of practical ways that organisations can reflect and respect that extended family network. So can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, so on a practical level, for example, here in Australia, when we talk about carers leave, for example, the strict definition tends to be the nuclear family. That's not always the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families are constructed, and we may actually have people in our families that are not biologically related. And so thinking about making sure that your HR policies, and particularly that one, actually are inclusive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander definitions of family, So it may be that there's a cousin that has a child that needs looking after, or my godson who's is an Aboriginal boy. I would look after him for his mother, even though we're not biologically related, because she's so close, she's like a sister. And that's just the way our families care for each other. So, and organisations probably need to start thinking and talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about what it is that they need. And that's just one example that I can think of. And it's probably the most obvious example.
Yeah. And when just hearing your answer, talking about the health sector, and of course, you've got many hats. This is one sphere, I guess, you're operating in, and that other sphere is the university world or the research world. So
yes.
Anything you recognise or see from there with regards to creating inclusiveness, like that's either done well or that you think could be brought across to other sectors?
So the university sector has this approach where there is expertise within a particular area, and it's probably like other areas as well. When it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, or even just more generally, they really give us the leeway to actually run the business or the subject like we're the experts in that space. And I know that a lot of organisations often don't value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as highly as they would other people with expertise. And so I think it's actually making sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are given the freedom to actually create their business to meet the needs of both the community that they're serving as well as the employer. And, there needs to be inherent trust. I think that sometimes, while is really fantastic in the university sector, doesn't always happen externally. And again, I do sometimes think it's because there is this misunderstanding or this false dialogue around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the negative stereotypes that we see. And I don't see that as much in the university sector.
So is that a media element? Of course, that's another sphere that you operate a lot in. Where does this false stereotype get perpetuated from? I mean, that's a big question. I realize it comes from so many angles, but my leading question is, where does the media come into that?
Look, that's why I started writing. I actually started writing for COACHEES because I was sick and tired of seeing the way the media portrayed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or the really one-dimensional way that we were portrayed. So when there is a crisis in one of our communities, that crisis seems to be all that's communicated about that community. And so the whole narrative about that community becomes that crisis. And there's lots of other things, like all communities, that are happening that are positive as well as negative. Yeah. And so the media has a large role to play in the ongoing stereotyping, which actually feeds racism of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other minority groups. So it's not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've seen the media talk about African gangs in Melbourne.
Yeah. They're even more specific than that, aren't they?
Yeah. So the media has a large role to play, but again, so does our education system, and it is getting better. Our education systems are getting better, but we do actually need to see some significant changes if we're actually to have a society where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can just be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I have a small anecdote there, and then I've got a question. I've got a little boy who's 14, 15 months, and so he's pre-education, but his counting books and his alphabet books are Australian, and they're illustrated by an Aboriginal artist. Her name's Bronwyn Bancroft. And we always joke because, I mean, they're beautiful, they're lovely. He's so engaged with them, but she gets to X and there's no Aboriginal animal that she brings up expert. So it just says X for X-ray, and then it goes on to Y for Yabby, and she's got a beautiful picture for Yabby. So he's getting a great little, pre-K education, but it's we need to fund education for the letter X. That's mine. But so on that train of thought that you were having, like around media and the role, my sense is, like, I've seen a lot more Aboriginal representation in the media through COVID. Interestingly, I don't know if you've had a similar set. You're much more immersed in it than I am, and I'm living overseas, so I'm probably getting a very different perspective. But I think because, in my perception, you tell me if I'm thinking along the same lines, is there seems to be a lot of Aboriginal people in the arts, and the arts has been disproportionately affected by COVID. And also art is an expression of this human experience and some of the, you know, the more nuanced experiences that are coming out. And so because I'm a dork and I watch a lot of ABC and SBS, there seems to be a lot more dialogue. So I don't know, one, do you see the same? Or two, do you think that this is an opportunity, an inflection point, or is there some kind of like downside? Because obviously there's a lot of the real feelings are coming through. The anger, the frustration is absolutely palpable. How does that come through, or like how does that question land for you? What's your reflections?
So there certainly has been a fair bit of conversation around the arts, because you're right, and we talk about arts more broadly here, including the music industry, theatre, and obviously other types of arts. But there's also been a lot of conversation in the media about how well the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sector is doing, at least in media like COACHEES. And when you talk about ABC and SBS, they've also been showcasing a lot of the dialogues that the Prime Minister has been having with Pat Turner, the CEO of NATCHO, and also the chair of the Coalition of Peaks, because what they've been doing while COVID's been happening is negotiating the new Closing the Gap targets. So there's a range of reasons why we've actually been seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people increase in the media. And I actually think that it's a positive, because when you're normalising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on your screens, you're actually just normalising us generally. I know that's probably not quite the answer you were looking for.
No.
But for me, it has been, I have seen an increase, but interestingly enough, there is an independent research project which has identified the significant lack of diversity in the media, particularly, and including SBS as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, I mean, whatever your answer is a good one. So you're very submerged in what's happening locally, and I'm obviously not there. So it's a very much for me an outside in perspective at this point. Do you see any other, like, opportunity makes it sound so, it's the wrong word, but do you see any other emergence that comes through COVID for this community? Like any other trend that,
I do actually. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, despite the fact that we are more likely to have chronic diseases and comorbidity, so more than one, and a range of other potential health concerns, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been underrepresented in the COVID figures. So we've seen very few deaths, if any. I think there may have been one, and we've seen very few cases of COVID. Now, the reason for that is unclear at this point, but one of the potential reasons is the fact that we have an Aboriginal community-controlled health sector here in Australia, which is Aboriginal services run by and for Aboriginal people. So they actually have, before COVID was even declared a pandemic as early as February, actually started to work with their communities and produce resources to keep our communities safe.
Yeah.
They lobbied and advocated for community closures really early on.
Yeah.
And so what we've actually seen is the fact that when Aboriginal community controlled health services actually take charge and are given the license to do that by the government, then, well, not even the license, they weren't given the license, the government just didn't interfere. We can see the strength and the power that these communities have to keep our mob safe. So for me, what that does demonstrates to the broader community is that we actually just need to be leading the charge on making sure our communities are healthy and safe. And that often isn't something that is considered, because again, most people think of us in deficit. And if you think about us just in our deficits, you'll never see our strengths. So this is while it's a tragic time for so many families, this is actually a time where it's showcasing exactly what Aboriginal communities are capable of.
Yeah. Voice, and as you said, like not waiting to be given a license. This is what we need, and here's the movement. And so does that happen through, like the example that comes to my mind, and I'm sure there's a lot of them, but I know in particular the Northern Territory was really clear about its border closures, and that because of its, it has a larger proportion, my understanding, you tell me if I'm right, a significant population of Aboriginal people in that case, that was a significant part of the decision. So is that is that a movement or a group or an organisation behind that, or is it a community swell?
So the Aboriginal community controlled health organisations are really political, as well as offering primary healthcare services to their members and their clients. So you've got a large number of really proactive and politically savvy organisations in the Northern Territory. So you've got AMSANT, which is the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance Northern Territory. And you've also got big services like MeWatch in Nullumboy and Arnhem Land, and Congress in Alice Springs. So these services would have been collaborating and working with the state government to actually protect their communities. And that's, again, part of the benefit of being such a collective society, is that when times like this, we come together and we work on solutions as a collective, rather than going it alone and taking the individualistic approach, which I see many people and nations taking.
Yeah. Noted. I also see that. It's really interesting. And so bringing it back into an organisation perspective, when you were saying a huge positive shift is when you can see people just taking action, but not having a license or maybe being handed it, or even having that space created, but like saying, no, this is what we need, and stepping forward. I acknowledge that's a huge, like a hard thing for anyone to do, is to just claim space. When you see that inside an organisation, how would other people within a business, like my sense, and I know I'm mumbling around this question, but everybody's got their different objectives, agendas, things that they're trying to get onto the radar of a business. If I was that individual within an organisation, what are the kind of steps or the voice or the things that I could be doing to kind of raise that and elevate that and get it onto, I guess, a leadership memo, so to speak?
Yeah, it's actually a really big question, because I think largely it comes down to the individual dynamics of an organisation, but also the personality and approach of somebody. I'm a bit of an agitator, so a bit of a dog with a bone. I don't know if that'll resonate with your wider audience, but you know, it is about, so I'm the kind of person where if I hear a no, but I know it's a really good cause, I try and figure out why it's a no, and then try and actually overcome those potential barriers. So I think it's about persistence and about building a business case or evidence around why this is important and why the organisation will benefit from this. So I don't always think that organisations or companies should do things just because it benefits them, but they do actually have to sell it to their shareholders or to whoever owns the company, and knowing that there is a solid business case that will actually benefit both the people that they're referring to, but also the organisation can't hurt. When it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stuff specifically, I mean, if you're in Australia, your company is built on Aboriginal land. Yeah. And I think acknowledging and respecting that and engaging with the Aboriginal community appropriately, and even promoting particular causes, like 2 days ago, it was Indigenous Literacy Day.
I saw that on your Twitter, yeah.
Yeah, so even just simple things like promoting that within your organisation, which is a charitable organisation, to generate potential donations, I think is a big thing to do.
Yeah, and recognising that's definitely something I've been more conscious of since we've been in discussion, and I see things like that pop up, and part of me thinks, oh yeah, it's good for awareness, but it carries through to other aspects of what you do. It does follow you. It follows your thoughts, and therefore has a longer tail, I guess, in terms of the impact it can have. What does it feel like for that individual? I mean, you're talking about your own experience, and I'm, thinking about multitudes of people who are embedded in their organizations of, you said you're an agitator. For people who maybe don't feel like they want to be an organizer or be a voice or be I can imagine, and I've even seen you say it as well, like, it's not my job to educate everybody. And I genuinely feel that. Like, where does that friction come from the individual to feel like, look, the respect is a foundation that we believe in, then how do I move the agenda if I personally don't want to be the champion moving forward? I wonder about individual friction in that sense.
Look, there's soft advocacy, and there's obviously more blatant advocacy, and not everyone's going to do what I do, which is, you know, sometimes be the front person or the agitator. But there are gentle ways of advocating, and it could be as simple as sending an article around to people you think might actually like it. So not a group email to everybody within the company, but to your colleagues that have expressed an interest in a particular topic. It is maybe thinking about how you can include alternative voices in the conversation. So it might be, I actually think wow would be really good to join this conversation. So I mean, it's what we do, I think, in life generally, is start planting the seed. And you were talking about how with the Literacy Foundation, it follows you around, and just planting those seeds and planting them over and over again in a really gentle way is actually really effective as well. So, and that's what I used to do when I was younger, when I didn't have as much confidence as I do now, and I didn't have the skills that I have obviously developed over time. But it would literally be just those little tiny seeds, which if everybody is doing that, obviously makes a significant impact.
Yeah. And for any movement, like we think about, you know, a feminist movement as an example, it's one that I can put myself in the shoes of. You see a full spectrum of people who have their styles, as you say, the seed planters and the more kind of, you know, long range embracing kind of style, the kind of more agitator, like it's assertive, but let's deal with it front on. But then you absolutely have a space for anger and for frustration and for the more aggressive style of getting in front of people, which I don't begrudge any movement. And I know I mentioned that previously, that now we're having a moment in time where we see feelings that were suppressed, that were real. They're coming up. They come up through the media. They come up in relationships. They come up through glaringly obvious things that are baked into systems, etc. My sense is that some organizations have the intent and know that it's the right thing. They don't need the business case always. They just, as humans, know it's the right thing to build inclusive organizations. But they don't know how, when they crack open the feelings that are very valid, what they do with them next. You know, how do you be a part of, and, you know, reconciliation is such a beautiful language in Australia, but the how part is I don't know if I'm articulating that well, if like, how do you embrace and let people feel angry, and then what do you do with it? Not trying to solve it, but yeah.
Well, I guess it's like any change management though. It's a change management process, and I think when you're talking about, I mean, we're not going to see massive shifts in most organisations, so it is going to be less in your face. If we're talking about people being angry, it's actually giving them safe spaces to actually express that and then work through that. Anger is a helpful emotion most of the time when it's used constructively, and it actually lets us, as you would know as a psychologist, explore different things. And I mean, you're probably better explaining this than me. I'm using, you know, lay language.
I just bumbled all my questions. Don't worry about it. Obviously not.
But I think, I mean, I'm a person that believes that we should be expressing our emotions and feeling them. We can't bottle them up. And if we do, we're actually not really allowing other people to see the impact. So I don't get angry that often, particularly in the workplace, for example. But I know if I get really angry about a particular thing that's happening in one of my organizations that I work for, people know, we've stepped over the line. And so I think that we need to be able to express that, to then actually explore it and understand why that emotion's occurring, where it's coming from, and how we address the issues that have caused it. So for an organisation, I appreciate that it can be really challenging. And if we're talking, for example, around Black Lives Matter, and you have Black people and non-people of colour within your organisation, that actually can be significant tensions. So you need to make sure that you're protecting both in that, to actually make sure that the conversation doesn't disintegrate into something that is actually really unhelpful. But there are a lot of trying conversations at the moment, I would imagine, particularly around COVID and approaches to COVID. I don't envy managers and CEOs having to navigate some of the challenges at the moment.
Yeah, and to do it, I think that's why ignorance is actually a strategy.
Bliss, yep.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss. Of like the path of least resistance is don't open the box,
Yeah.
which isn't brave, but is also defensive. Like it's a mechanism, I would say, to...
It is a mechanism. And when we're talking about dominant culture, it has been the mechanism for quite some time. So
Yeah.
sweeping under the carpet the injustices done to Indigenous people in all countries, as well as Black people more generally. So when we're doing that, I absolutely understand why people want to stay in their bubble and they don't want to get uncomfortable, but our mob dying. And so while you're, not you, but you know, whoever is feeling like they actually want to stay ignorant, your uncomfortableness, if you get out of that bubble, is a damn sight easier than watching people die or be sick. So I would say just put your shoes in an Indigenous family, like put your feet in an Indigenous family's shoes or that of a Black family and think, maybe I can get a little uncomfortable, you know?
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I did see how long it's been, I think, again, like on Twitter, the font of all knowledge lately, of course, actually how long it's been since the Aboriginal deaths in custody report came out, like 30 years. It's been like most of our lives since that's come through. And for people not to... I'm interested to hear your thoughts on where the failings are there, because to have that out for so long and to not have people in those shoes or understanding there's nothing more serious than death.
Can't take death back.
So how do you bring that to the forefront? Like how do you get that into people's caring radius? If whatever we've done so far obviously hasn't been it.
We need politicians to stop taking a law and order approach. Law and order, I absolutely believe there is a need for law and order on a level that protects society. So if we're talking about, you know, sexual crimes or, you know, violent crimes, but then when we're talking about public drunkenness and people are actually locked up for public drunkenness and die because of that, I mean, this should be about pastoral care. This isn't a law and order issue. If someone has passed out on a train, like happened with Tanya Day, who then died while she was locked up, when she could have been at home with her family and she wouldn't have died, we actually have a problem with our legal system. So what we need is politicians to stop actually taking the very popular route of law and order and start thinking about the human aspect. We have had... So people think, for example, that Black Lives Matter is something that's not relevant here in Australia because they don't always know about things like the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody. And essentially, most of the 330 plus recommendations have not been implemented. We still have people being locked up for public drunkenness. So for me, it has to start with the politicians, and they need to start thinking about all of their population, not just the people that are actually going to put them in power, i.e. the dominant culture.
Economic force, and dominant culture, as you say, as well, in Australia being the white culture. Or is it a culture? White population,
No, white, it is a culture. It is,
okay.
Sociologically speaking, it's definitely a culture.
That's interesting.
But
Here there's been a big push. Obviously there's very different histories, different accumulation of experiences that lead to that moment in that cell, like micro things that accumulate and create that perfect storm, horrible perfect storm. Here, for similar reasons, some of the public sentiment has been towards defund the police, because if the aggression and the violence is happening in that space, and that's where we're seeing people get, you know, like that's where you're seeing the outcome, the brunt of that social movement. Has that been discussed in Australia as part of this? Is that a language on the street?
So there's definitely been some discussion around defunding the police. It probably hasn't been as big a conversation as things like Royal Commission's Death in Custody, making sure that people aren't locked up for fine infringement or for public drunkenness. But there certainly has been some conversation about it, but I don't think it's had quite as much traction as what it's had in the US. Here in Australia, what we normally are talking about are the structural issues. So just a cop on the street actually doesn't have a lot of autonomy. A senior person will tell them to do something. They have to do it as part of their job. So what we need to be looking at is the structural issues, which again is around things like, what do you do when you find someone who is drunk on a train? Do you take them home? Is that what the first recommendation is? So thinking about the more humanitarian approach is what we're asking for more generally from everybody, politicians, the police, the average person on the street.
Yeah. And is the police even the person you call in that situation? Are there other health services, coming back to your sector, because you're dealing with a very discrete instance there, but there's this accumulation of history that's led that person to that moment. And so it's not a, yeah. Is it a different kind of professional? Yeah.
I've had this conversation. I've got a very good girlfriend who is a policewoman. So we've had some interesting conversations during a number of events here in Australia. But one of the things that, she has acknowledged is that police are not actually trained as health professionals.
Yeah.
And in most circumstances,
or social workers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in most circumstances, health professionals or social workers would be better placed.
Or psychologists, not to say we solve everything.
No, but you're right. I think psychologists actually have a better insight into human behaviour and actually how to treat people appropriately, rather than, and I think police, in all fairness, they rarely see the best of society. They're often seeing people at their worst.
Yeah,
and so
they have an accumulated history too of things that they're bringing into that moment. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's so true. And so all of these things that we're talking about that are happening on the street in people's lives, and as we were saying, when we bring them back into an organisation, letting that discussion and that dialogue happen, because it's people's real life, and a lot of us are still working from home, and there's this combination now. It's not work and life, it's life mashed together. So being able to create that dialogue, we often talk about creating a psychologically safe space where people have voice and where they can both express opposite opinions, know that they can make mistakes and learn, because they're going to say things that are wrong, they're going to say things that are right, and that there's a positive intent amongst it. So how do you see that play out in your workplaces? Like, do you feel like you and your colleagues have psychological safety to talk about the things that are important that you see come up from your life into your work?
I don't work at places that I don't feel safe.
Yeah, good point.
Well, as an Aboriginal woman, when I'm working in Aboriginal affairs, you have to feel safe. Otherwise, it just won't be healthy for me, and I wouldn't be able to achieve what I wanted to achieve for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people more broadly. But what that safety looked like is exactly what you were talking about. It has to be positive intent. So when I was younger, I probably would get frustrated, annoyed, or even angry with people if they did say the wrong thing. But I've come to realize that sometimes people say the wrong thing because they don't know any better, or they're trying to find the right words and they just don't know what they are. But the issue that I have with people generally, and this also happens in the workplace, is when they disagree, argue, or dispute something that I'm telling them in a way that tells me that they're actually not really listening, or they're not really willing to listen. But in the workplace, so part of my role at the University of Wollongong is working with my colleagues to include Indigenous content in the curriculum. So that sometimes actually is having some tough conversations, and it's a little uncomfortable sometimes for both of us, that it's actually recognizing that we're both here because we want to do something right, and that we both probably need to be a little more mindful of what the other person's thinking and feeling. But I have to say, I remember having a conversation with a gentleman who was a non-Aboriginal man, and he was wondering why, when he went to a forum, when he expressed his views about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, an Aboriginal man shut him down and got really angry. And I said, right, tell me about this forum. And I said, was it majority Aboriginal or majority non-Aboriginal? And he goes, majority non-Aboriginal. And I said, great. So were there lots of non-Aboriginal people sharing their views? And he said, oh, probably. And I said, well, did you actually stop and think that maybe that Aboriginal man, when he was sitting in there, was feeling like he didn't have a voice, that he didn't have the capacity, and that's probably how he's felt his entire life. So when he was getting cross with you and you got annoyed with him, you weren't actually recognizing that experience that he's brought with him that's culminated with him telling you off. So maybe as a non-Aboriginal person, you need to sit back, listen and watch, and let Aboriginal people speak first. And then maybe if you think it's appropriate, have a conversation. Don't always, I know everyone has a right to have an opinion, but it doesn't mean those opinions are always right. And it doesn't always mean it's the right time to share that opinion.
Yeah, thinking about optics, I think is, you know, really reflecting on yourself and then thinking like, how does this look?
Yeah.
Can be a really important thing. Yeah, and what's your thoughts on white men at the moment? That's a big question.
It's like, whoa, I'm living with a white man.
You talk about God. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I know a lot of them, and I think they come in all forms. Like some are great, some are terrible. They come everywhere in between. And I think they're having a psychological experience at the moment because there's a perceived, you know, you see the worst of it online where people are thinking, okay, I have to resort into my racist, misogynist camp because this is where I'm safe and where I'm valued, versus, okay, like I'm a modern, thoughtful, emotional person and I want to be inclusive of others. And now all of a sudden I've realized that I'm not, like the privileges I had before don't stand anymore. And that is something that I just have to notice and recognize. Like, I'm not giving sympathy, but there's a very unique experience there as society rebalances or takes a balance for the first time, maybe, because I'm not saying it has been balanced before. Yeah, do you have any perspective on their experience?
It is a significant shift. And you're absolutely right. So they saw the world in a particular way, and they were oblivious, I think, on some level to the fact that they were privileged. And so now that they're being told that they're privileged, they're aware of what they feel they might lose, even though it's not a pie that's kind of, you know, to be cut up and we're taking some of their pie. I again, it's very much like people who hold prejudicial views or racist views. It's similar in the sense that they're going to have to face their own uncomfortableness and their own worldview that is now being shattered. So they have to recreate their own identity around this new world. And some of them just don't like it. But then, you know, my dad's a non-Aboriginal man. He's a white fella, and so is my partner. And both of them have had some, I wouldn't say challenging conversations, but interesting conversations. And I mean, when you have daughters or you're married to a woman, or, you know, you have other women in your life, I would hope that these men would sit back and actually have a conversation and understand what it's like to be a woman. So my partner's got 3 younger brothers. He's got no sisters. So he's a little bit oblivious to what women go through often, actually a lot. But even having a conversation with him about sexual harassment and what that looks like, as a woman, and I know you've probably had this, you know, we've been whistled at. I've been groped when I was younger out at bars and pubs. Sexual assault has occurred, and it happens to all women at different stages, and not necessarily all the way up to sexual assault, but women experience. And so actually sharing with him that while he may not have done that to women, there are asshole men in the world, sorry for swearing, that actually do take advantage of that. And that's why we need men to be on board with us, because they need to talk to other men. It actually shouldn't be our job.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's and there is there's power, and danger comes with power at the same time. And I agree with you. Like the whole system was designed with, like, by white men for white men. And so for other groups, no matter which lens you come from, to then try to infiltrate or to redesign or create new spaces that are beyond that, I see this huge opportunity and this opening up, this flourishing, this, like, I just get so much energy from thinking about all the redesign and the new scope that we have. And at the same time, I also have this lingering sense of danger, which is an interesting like association to have of you said like, okay, don't work in spaces where you don't feel safe. And there are elements of society and this redesign that just don't feel safe to me at the moment. And I think that's where people shy away from being the assertive standing up. So that's not something that we can solve, and it's not a nice thought to have, but it does give me another sense of like how these things don't get cracked down in a workplace, and that maybe that's why they're left to family and government on bookends of a business. I think the business, they try to do a lot of stuff around diversity and inclusion, and it should be a neutral space, a neutral safe space for people, but we fail at it so often because it's so much bigger.
Yeah, and I actually appreciate the lack of safety that you feel, because sometimes I feel that as well, particularly as an Aboriginal woman who's quite proactive in a number of spaces, and also some other female-related issues. I do sometimes feel unsafe, but I actually remind myself that if I didn't do it, who will?
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm a resilient person who has a good work history, so I know that if anything happens within my workplace, I'd be able to get another job. So financially, I'll be fine. I have great family support, friends, network. So I've got that kind of personal support that I need. And every time I think about how uncomfortable I am, I think about the fact that I can do this as safer than most people.
Yeah.
And I had a bit of a crisis about this a couple of years ago, and I ended up speaking to a friend of mine who was a lawyer, a white man who was a lawyer during apartheid in South Africa.
Wow.
And so he was working in an Aboriginal organisation, so you can imagine what his attitudes to apartheid were. And he actually said to me, yeah, if you stick your head up, you're likely to get shot at. And he was in the army, so he tended to use
literal
army and, but you need people to stick their head up if you're going to change the status quo. So you need to decide whether or not that's something that you can live with.
Yeah.
And at times I'm not brave, and at times I actually turn the TV off and turn my phone off and have a weekend where I'm just me.
Yeah.
And then you go back after being recharged. So.
And what do you do to restore yourself so that you can keep contributing and putting your head up?
Well, sometimes I go and get massages. I love massages.
Yeah.
I think they solve a multitude of issues.
It's another downside of COVID. I haven't had one since like February or something. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I could appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's reading a book that is just a book, a novel. So I read fantasy novels because it's complete escapism.
Yeah.
And sometimes I watch crap TV like Vampire Diaries or Suits or something that is just entertaining for the sake of entertaining.
Bubblegum. Yeah. Is there such a genre as, and I know this is a totally ignorant question, but is there a genre of Aboriginal fantasy novels?
Well, there's Aboriginal comic book.
Okay.
There's Aboriginal fantasy TV show, and I actually should remember the name of it, but I can't remember. But there's also chick lit. So Anita Heiss has written chick lit, which is just light, fluffy books. The lead character happens to be Aboriginal, but it is not the main purpose of the book.
Yeah.
So for me, you've got, so I'm just opening up. So we actually have a lot of comic book characters as well.
Cool. Okay, I'll have to check that out. The reason I ask is because I know in North America for African American people, there's not just for them, but through that movement, there was I think it's called Afrofuturismo. I don't have the right language, but it's a whole genre of African American futuristic fantasy novels. Okay. I think it might be I'm probably the Hollywood version is the Black Panther movies of like imagining different scenarios, and I find it really beautiful because one thing that you look at with people in trauma, and if I could say that, like our histories are full of trauma, both individual trauma and cultural trauma of the things that we have done to each other and targeted at specific populations. For healing to happen, if you look at an individual person, healing through post-trauma can sometimes happen through fantasy. where you use imagined different outcomes to give your brain relief. It's not to say we don't acknowledge those things happened, or that we don't still have to explore them, understand them, say sorry for them, reconcile with them. But that if we just want to give our brains a space to say, all right, like we need some restorative recovery neuro time, imagine something different. Imagine a different outcome. And that's why I love those books, because I think our whole culture gets to reimagine itself in its strongest, most beautiful, like flourished form. So I don't know if you have any reflection. I don't know what the topic of the comics are, if it has any of that service to the culture.
The comics aren't comedy, but they're still obviously quite entertaining. But for me, when I think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's relief, we tend to actually use comedy. So you've got black comedy on ABC, which can be challenging for non-Aboriginal people to watch. I think it's hilarious and I love it.
Yeah.
But comedy generally, like even just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander humour. So you'll find that some of the most traumatised people within our communities still have a fantastic sense of humour within their own communities and family. So, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I can certainly appreciate and reflecting on, we have a strong sense of humour within our community. And it's quite a wicked sense of humour too. And it can be slightly dark that you have, and it can sometimes, you know, if you're in with a bunch of older women, it can take on this really naughty sexual type sense of humour. It's quite funny hearing stuff coming from an elder and you're just like, oh. And it's not, you know, anything that's more than PG, but it's still quite funny. So I can appreciate why, you know, that escapism and that, probably
and
why I like fantasy.
Exactly, like to give you, there's so many benefits to it, I think, as well, as long as you're not only in that space, but it gives you one space to kind of retreat to. Yeah, exactly. And so thinking about psychological safety in the workplace, you gave me some great stats previously. I know you're full of acronyms and stats, which I think is fantastic. You probably have to, know those off the top of your head. But my sense, and I know I'd reflected this to you before, was that I had a feeling that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were mostly working in either health services or tourism space. And I know that they're working, throughout other industries as well. Do you know that off the top of your head again, or do I have to ask you which are the areas that they're in?
So health and community services is the biggest employer of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector is the largest employer of Aboriginal people within the health space.
Okay.
So they're one of the largest people employers.
And is that health services delivered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or is it more for other community members as well?
So they are Aboriginal, and so Aboriginal community-controlled health services are comprehensive primary health services, which are run as NGOs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Right.
But most of them don't exclude non-Aboriginal people from accessing their service. They have limited resources, so sometimes it might be a partner of. Or a father, so it would be a close relation can use the services, or it can be a non-Aboriginal woman who's going to give birth to an Aboriginal child. So, if they need prenatal care, they go and see the service. So we don't tend to be exclusively Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but there are some services within a service that need to be because government only funds it for an Aboriginal person, i.e. dental.
Okay, got you. And so I'm thinking in those spaces, because of the nature of the service and because the nature of I'm assuming that the employees are mostly as well Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They're from the community that they're serving, or are they?
Sometimes it varies. So we know that, for example, only about 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are employed. We also know that we don't have the same levels of education that other people have in the country. So we have a little bit of and we also are a really young population. So about 60% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is under the age of 30.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we're a really young population, which is something you often see in developing or third world countries. So we actually do have non-Aboriginal people working within our space.
Okay.
And there's a lot of really amazing non-Aboriginal people working in our space. So, for example, Tim Senior, who was a doctor out at Tharawal, he's an Englishman who's lived in Australia for a long time. He's fantastic. He's a very supportive person within our space. So, but they're usually, so the board is made up of Aboriginal people. So the expectation is that people will engage in a culturally appropriate way within that service.
Okay. I'd love to dig into it more. I know we don't have the capacity here, but I'm trying to think about what is it that makes that space safe to be an employer of choice for that community, and to be an employer of, you know, the majority of that community. There must be so much to dig into about what you could learn from that to potentially take to other organisations too.
So again, they create a culturally safe place. And that's first and foremost what they do. As an Aboriginal organisation and as a not-for-profit and a non-government organisation, their primary focus is delivering care to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a way that is going to meet all of their needs, culturally as well as physically. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are accepting, and again, it's that collective nature. So their primary focus is care. And when you've got an organisation which is caring for everybody, even non-Aboriginal people that come in the space, then that makes it a safe place to work and to come in. And I think, again, clinical services have to do clinical accreditation here in Australia to make sure that they're able to deliver the care that they say they're going to deliver. They also then have legislation which is around HR, all of that kind of stuff, work health and safety, all of the government related stuff as well. But then they have the cultural lens that they're applying over all of that. And that cultural lens infiltrates every aspect of the work that they do. And I mean, I think, you know, when you've got a board that is running an organisation or governing an organisation, and then they've identified a CEO that then can embody the values that board expects them to embody within the workplace, you're going to see positive change.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing. It's a values-based workplace as opposed to an economically driven workplace.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's also purpose designed. Whereas what we're talking about is, and as we said before, there was a design at some stage of, you know, whoever was the main users of our organizations back when they were created, and that now we're trying to work out how do we retroactively fit ourselves, our new modern workforce with all of its diversity. The fruit salad, I heard someone, there's some great research around racism. You've probably seen a lot of it where, you know, people often used to talk about a melting pot, and this, you know, the researchers would say, why are you talking about a melting pot? Like, that's when everything boils down, it all becomes the same. We should be talking about fruit salads where you chop everything up and it each maintains its distinctiveness. And that's what I think about as organizations now. Like, how do we create fruit salad organizations, but that the business has to be designed now for a fruit salad, which is a real retroactive approach.
It is, but I think we can stop and think about, like, I remember reading an article that Bronwyn Fredericks, who is a professor at the University of Queensland, wrote quite a while ago, looking at the physical space of a mainstream health service. And I think this applies to other organisations. So what is it about the physical space that is actually excluding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So when she looked around the room, all of the art was by non-Aboriginal people. The person behind the counter was a non-Aboriginal person, and the counter was really high, so it puts up this barrier between us and them. If you wanted to go, so they did have an Aboriginal room where they would run Aboriginal programs. You would have to ask the white receptionist to have access to that. So then you're having to ask permission to access something that's set up for you. So there's that power imbalance. So again, when we're thinking about workplaces, thinking about recognizing significant events for people of a variety of cultures, actually having the kind of symbols on the wall that demonstrate, and not the tokenistic symbols, but actually making it look and feel as if it is a fruit salad, rather than actually as a white space that just happens to have people from other cultures in it.
Yeah. No, I think the way you smell a place, so to speak, is actually so important. like the real depth of what you can get viscerally, as opposed to just the optics are important, but as you said, how the values actually come out through that space is so key.
It's signposting. So when you're doing that in a genuine, authentic way, you're signposting to someone who walks in there into your organisation, this is actually a safe place for me.
And where do you see the boundary there between, because obviously, you know, one of the language that we see come through a lot at the moment is moral signalling. Is that the right word? Virtue signalling.
Virtual signalling, yeah.
Where is the line between a genuine culture that's trying to represent the fruit salad versus the virtue signalling part?
Well, again, talking about smell, you can sniff out someone who's just virtual signalling really quickly. So if I was to walk into an organisation and they had an Aboriginal flag on the wall, but that was literally all they had, that for me is a bit of it's like a token, whack it up there. For me, if you're in an organisation and you want to diversify, say even your physical space, you actually talk to the people who are from the culture that you're wanting to actually be inclusive of and ask them what they would want.
Yeah.
And if you can actually, you can tell the difference when you walk into a room, and it feels different when it's done by people that are from your culture. Because there's a genuine and authenticity rather than having like a Chinese didgeridoo propped up against the wall. They might have a local artist that they've commissioned to do, you know, a mural that tells the history of the country, because that requires effort and it requires thought. So if you can see the effort and thought that's gone into something, you know that they're genuine in their attempt.
It does. So much of it comes back to art as well, doesn't it? Of being able to use that as an expression of what's happening in your unspoken culture right now too. And yet they're so undercut through COVID as well.
Yeah.
So you shared with me a great initiative that you're wanting to showcase. It's called CLAN, which stands for Caring and Living as Neighbours, which is just such a beautiful name. So this initiative supports children with congenital conditions and syndromes. So initially, it seems like they started in Vietnam, but then they've extended to Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan as well. They have several syndromes that they kind of zero in on and support the children on with their health services. So what can you tell us, like, why is CLAN compelling to you?
So CLAN for me is an organisation which is working with children that are often overlooked in our countries. And for me, children are the future, regardless of whether or not they've got a chronic condition. They have so much that they can contribute. And I think that when it comes to conditions like non-communicable diseases, otherwise known as chronic diseases, often these children are living in some of the worst conditions within their own countries. And what this program does, it doesn't come in and it doesn't do the helicopter where you get these people from outside your country actually coming in to dictate how things should be run. It actually works with the community to be able to support these children more broadly, so it's sustainable. And it's that sustainability that I think is really important. I'm really passionate about making sure that every child has opportunities to be whatever it is they want to be and live their life in a successful and full way. And part of that is actually building up the community around them, not just focusing on that individual.
Absolutely. Just looking through the website, it does look like they've been such a hands-on, really practical, very tangible operation. So I'm glad to know about them. Thank you. I'll keep watching them. So I know we need to land. So I'll finish by asking you a couple of rapid fire questions. And before we do that, I just want to thank you as well. I really appreciated the conversation. I feel for myself personally that it's like I'm learning so much through this conversation and through my other conversations, not because anyone's job is to educate me. I know my own clumsiness and I know my own, limitations. And so it's just such a wonderful thing to meet minds with people like you. So I appreciate it very much, the time and the thought. So, sorry.
Now, I was going to say thank you for letting me share as well, because when we're talking about organisations, I know we were focusing on what organisations can do, but organisations are made up of people that have particular worldviews and understandings, and even just sharing more general conversations around this will hopefully infiltrate organisations so that they do become safer places.
I agree. Yeah, as I said, our work is our life now, so we have to have much broader conversations. So I'll ask the question, and if you can finish off my sentence with whatever, resonates for you. The world right now is?
Challenging, but hopeful.
Love it. A question I wish I would never be asked again.
Why do you identify as Aboriginal? You could pass as white.
Okay, we should have started the whole podcast with that one for another day. My family think I do what for work all day?
Talk.
Talk. I'm just a talker.
Yep.
Are they right?
Pretty much.
Yeah, it's a good job.
Yeah.
My gift to the next guest is?
Have fun, enjoy it, and to be honest with you, yeah, actually, can you just ask me that again if you're going to cut it? Are you going to cut that?
No, that's okay. Yeah. My gift to the next guest is?
Have fun, enjoy it, and make sure that you're true to yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I appreciate the truthfulness in all aspects of this conversation. So thank you, Summer. The Real Work has been hosted by me today, Alex Lamb, and wouldn't be possible without the contributions of our whole team here at Lanterne Rouge. Production support has been managed by Mark Hayes, and that's it for now. So we'll see you at work. Thank you.